Welcome to Divcasts from the University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
All right. Well, I think we're ready to begin. The third of 3 lectures in this series, Problem of Evil and the Relation Between Heaven and the Human in Classical Chinese Philosophy. Many of you, I see, were here for the previous 2 talks, so our speaker needs no introduction for you. Professor Frank Perkins, currently at DePaul University, also at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore for this year, right? And the one thing I do want to add is I now have a physical copy of Professor Perkins' book, latest book, Heaven and Earth Are Not Humane. I'm just going to pass this around to take a look at while he begins his talk. And so without further ado, Professor Perkins.
All right, well, thank you all for coming again. I was just telling Brooke that I think from the discussions after these talks and then talking with him and other people after the talks, my thinking about this keeps evolving as I'm going. I was actually just changing a slide like after they were already projected up here even. So particularly near the end of the paper, I'm still kind of sorting stuff out in my own mind a bit. I'll start off just kind of with the trajectory of these talks, given that this is the last one, and not all of you have been here for all of them, right? So I start off with a question about how to think of the problem of evil in a cross-cultural context, right? So a way that wouldn't be just limited to the way it's been formed in European philosophy. And I argued that I think the core of it is really the tension between these 2 premises. So an anthropocentric ethics, one centering on human beings, right? It could recognize the value of other things, but centering on human beings. And then a world that does not appear to be ordered according to that ethics, right? So the role of God in the problem is I think, not even necessary for the basic problem, right? Because just from the first 2, you get this sense that, on the one hand, you get a sense that maybe our ethics, our perspective is baseless, right? It can't be justified. It's sort of merely ours, merely human. On the other hand, given that we seem to have some desire to connect with the divine or harmonize with nature, there's a kind of sense of alienation, I think, that comes from there, right? This separation of ourselves, or almost opposition between ourselves and the world, or between ourselves and a God who would have created the world or designed the worlds. And then I also said then that the Chinese kind of go a middle course between this. And in particular, they want to hold on to some idea of following along with nature, generally while trying to hold on to some kind of ethics, right? And if you think about it in those terms, you can see a second formulation, right, which I call the problem of evil as a problem of following nature. And again, last time I posed the question, if we acted like God seems to have acted in creating the world, could we be considered moral, right? On the surface, I think the answer would have to be no, right? The world doesn't seem to work in a fair, good, a moral way. And there are lots of ways to get around that problem, of course, right? But on the surface, it seems like no. And so it seems like the answer to can following along with nature be ethical also would then be no. Right. This is the problem then that Chinese philosophers face, because they do want to keep some idea of following along with nature. So then I said the basis for that in the Warring States period is 2 ideas. One is sheng, which means to grow or generate or give birth, to live. Maybe you could translate it as vitality, generativity. And then the other is gong, a kind of sense of inclusivity or impartiality. Right. And I looked at various attempts to derive an ethics from this pairing of generativity, vitality, and impartiality. And I argued that it ultimately seems to not work, right? And it doesn't work because if we oppose life and death, then it seems in nature they both have a place, right? If we think instead about the generativity of nature as the kind of ongoing process of change and growth, then death is kind of meaningless in there, right? Harm is kind of meaningless in there. So there's no way to just say promote life, right? If we mean life in the sense of just growth, that's going on all the time. There's nothing to promote. If we mean life as contrasted to death, then nature can't really be a model for that, because death is part of nature, right? So this is what I have as the outcomes then of this idea of following along with nature's generation and impartiality. The main conclusion, I think, is that we have to accept both life and death as equally bad. And I think that goes in 2 different directions. One is an indifference toward them. So you equally accept life, equally accept death. This is, I think, basically Zhuangzi's kind of skeptical position, right? Life and death are both natural. There's no way to label one as good and one as bad. The other is to say that each has its appropriate place, and this leads into what is labeled as correlative cosmology. I gave a passage from the Han Feizi last time. That particularly works out with a sense that there's a time for punishing and a time for rewarding. There's a time for peace and there's a time for war, right? Two other options. One is to give up following nature in any kind of direct way, and I think that's Xunzi's position, right? And then the last one is what I want to talk about today, an attempt to keep a connection with the generativity, but give out the impartiality. Right, so we might say that nature does promote life in general, but the way that works out is that each thing strives to live and survive. Right, so the continuity between the generativity of nature and a particular thing in nature is not through life in general, but through the life of that particular thing. Right? We could say, I express the tendencies of nature, the growth of nature, through my own struggle to survive and to thrive. Such a view in the Chinese context is associated with Yang Zhu, who was famed for saying that he would not sacrifice a single hair off of his head in order to save the world. Right? It appears, I think, most clearly in the Lushu Chunqiu. One passage says, this actually appears in the Zhuangzi as well, says, in maintaining the genuine, the true, in maintaining the Tao, is maintaining one's body. Its fringes and leftovers are for the state and district. Its dirts and weeds are for managing the world. So the idea there is that your primary duty is to preserve your own life. If you happen to have some extra, you might help other people, right? There's an argument about this in another passage of the Lushu Chunqiu. So this says, Chui was the utmost craftsman, yet people do not love Chui's fingers, but rather love their own fingers, because they benefit from having them. People do not love the jade in Mount Kun or the pearls in the Han and Jiang rivers, but rather love their own azure jades, insignias, and small pearls because they benefit from having them. Now my life is what I have, and its benefits for me are the greatest. If I rank its value, even holding the position of the Son of Heaven does not compare. If I rank its importance, all the wealth in the world could not be exchanged for it. If I rank it in terms of risk, if it is lost for a moment, it can never be regained. These three are what those with the way are most earnest about. Now this passage, I think, is particularly interesting because this whole move toward appealing to our own sort of drives, the generativity of nature as it's in us, simultaneously advocates that while recognizing the kind of inclusivity of nature itself, right? So this is clearly working between a view of impartiality and partiality, because from an impartial perspective, it's saying, Chui's fingers are better than mine, right? Being the Son of Heaven is more valuable than my life. Right? That's the objective perspective. That's from the perspective of nature, we might say, right? The kind of impartial perspective. But that's not my perspective, and it's not, according to this, it's not a natural perspective, right? Our perspective is to care more about our fingers than the other guy's fingers. And the point here is to argue for taking care of your life. That's the goal of this argument, right? And it's particularly directed against, we'll see other passages about this, but against seeking excess that ends up doing damage to yourself, right? But it really is an argument for putting your own interest above that of other people, right? I guess that's not the point of the argument, but it is really, you know, according to this argument, if it came down to me having to lose my hand or Chui having to lose his hand, I would have him lose his hand, right? So it's putting your own interest above that of others, while recognizing that from an impartial perspective, these things are, they're actually not all equal, right? But the other guy's is better. But that's not the natural perspective for me, right? That's what I think this passage is arguing. Now that seems, I think, plausible and reasonable as an approach. I would say that Spinoza takes basically that approach, right? So for Spinoza, as an infinite mode of as a mode of infinite substance, a finite mode of infinite substance is what I am, right? It would be fundamentally mistaken to identify my interests with life or substance in general, with the whole, right? Rather, my interest lies in a struggle with and against other modes, all expressing, striving, or conatus in their own way, right? It's almost a kind of category mistake to say that because I'm part of a greater whole, I should identify with the whole rather than the part, given that I am a part, right? I think we could think of, again, of Nietzsche's interpretation of life as will to power, right? That it permeates all of nature. That's the driving force of all of nature. But I don't identify with that, right? I identify with my will to power, right? Now Spinoza brings this this drive to increase my own power into a fairly conventional kind of ethics of enlightened self-interest. We might think of Nietzsche as going a very different way that overturns conventional morality more radically than Spinoza does, I think. And in the Chinese context, you find, I think, both directions carried out, right? So the kind of prudence that you see in Spinoza of self-restraint, you find as a pretty common position in, say, the Lu Shi Chunqiu. So I give one example here. It says, now the nature of water is to be clear, but dirt disturbs it, and thus it fails to attain clarity. The nature of human beings is to live long, but things disturb it, and thus people fail to attain a long life. Things are that by which we nourish our nature, not that which our nature nourishes. Today, the confused often use their nature to nourish things, and thus do not know the difference between the weighty and the trivial. Right? This is pointing toward an idea of avoiding material excess as a way of preserving your own life, and saying that most people seek after wealth and all these kinds of things, ultimately to the harm of their own lives. Right? It's in the same section where there's an argument that an unrestrained person is better off poor than rich, because if they're rich, they'll basically just wear out their bodies with all the luxuries that they can use. Right? That's kind of the point of this passage. Also, I would say underlying it is probably a political agenda of a critique of the excesses of the upper classes, but that's not directly part of it. So this is kind of this ethics of self-restraint to preserve your life. One that's more about just kind of exerting your power is this passage I put up, I think, last time also, from Robert Zhi in the Zhuangzi. Right? He's lecturing Confucius here, lecturing Kongzi. I won't read through the whole thing because I read it before, right? But it ends by, well, it starts by saying, let me tell you about natural human feelings. The eyes desire to see beauty, the ears desire to hear good sounds, the mouth desires to explore flavors, the will and vital energies desire to flourish. And then it ends by basically saying, that's what it is to follow the Tao, right? Is to be able to do that, right? So this is one that's more focused on a kind of reckless enjoyment of life, right? Interestingly, part of the premise here is that if being cautious, those things, they don't guarantee anything, right? Part of the argument of the passage is life is uncertain, and you might do everything practically you can to live as long as you can and then just get killed, right? So you might as well just go for as much pleasure as you can. That seems to be the argument. Underneath, though, these different attitudes, I think there's actually a kind of difference about human nature. And you see a kind of debate, I think, on both sides working out through parts of the Lu Shi Chunqiu, where some people claim the purpose of life, our primary desire, is to live, right, is to survive. Other people argue that our primary drive, our primary desire is sensory pleasure. And that's a very different claim, right? And the one place where that works out, the contradiction between the passages work out, is a section in the Lu Shi Chunqiu that's basically an argument in favor of suicide. I didn't put the passage up, but the argument goes, would you rather listen to horrible music or not listen to any music? And they assume the answer is you'd rather not listen to music than listen to horrible music. Would you rather taste horrible food or not taste any food? They said, well, you'd rather not taste any food. It just goes through all the senses, and then it says, so there are some circumstances where being alive is worse than being dead, right? The previous passage, I think, would go against that, saying the primary goal is to stay alive, right? This is more along the lines of, no, the primary goal is to get sensory pleasure. And that points to a disagreement about human nature that's going on here, and I think that leads into Mengzi then. Right, so you can look at it as kind of three variants on what's fundamentally one approach, right? The basic approach is to say, you don't identify with life in general, but with your life. And life is maybe not quite the right way to put it, but Sheng would work better, the Chinese term, because it's not individuated actually in the way that life is exactly. It's just this generative vital force. You don't identify with that force in general, you identify with that force insofar as it's embodied in you, right? So the one position then is that that leads to preserving your own life, another is that that leads you to seek your own sensory pleasure, and the third position is that leads you to extend these natural dispositions, which is the position of Mengzi. And I'll explain more what that means if that's not clear enough by itself. Okay, so let me start though by saying a bit about, what do I have here? About Mengzi's view of heaven, right? Because I said that all these views, all these are often simultaneously recognizing that from, say, the perspective of Tian, from a kind of objective perspective, our life is no more valuable than anyone else's, right? So they're sort of recognizing the amorality of nature or something like that. And I think that Mengzi does that as well, right? I think Mengzi's view of heaven is that it does not hold on to human values and it does not enforce human values. That's a position that I argue for in that book quite a bit, right? It's a position, it's a debatable position, let's say. The strongest evidence for that, though, is a passage that says heaven has set it such that every 500 years there'll be a sage king who brings order to the world, right? And implied in that is that every 500 years things will descend into chaos and be awful, right? And both of those are set by heaven. So that's a pretty clear view of heaven as setting a cycle that's indifferent to order and disorder, indifferent to sort of suffering and peace, right? Because it's a 500-year cycle. There seems to be no preference either way. So I think that's a good example of what I mean when saying he sees heaven itself as impartial or inclusive, right? Another way to put it would be, if that's true, on Mengzi's account, could a good person imitate heaven? I think the answer is no. Like, Mengzi would say that no, a good person doesn't sometimes try to kill everybody and make things miserable and sometimes try to make everything good and peaceful, right? A good person only strives for peace. But that is not what heaven does, right? So this again gets to that split between them. Okay, so then the position he takes, as I say, is analogous to these, analogous to appeal to self-interest, but really based on a more complex account of what it is that we really want. Right, and this is, I think, the clearest statement of this. He says, fish is what I desire, bear paw is also what I desire. If these two cannot both be attained together, I give up the fish and take the bear paw. Life is what I desire, rightness also is what I desire. If these two cannot be attained together, I give up life and take rightness. Life is what I desire, but what I desire has something deeper than life. Thus I will not do crooked things to attain life. Therefore, in what one desires, there's something deeper than life, and in what one hates, there's something deeper than death. It is not just worthies that have this heart. All people have it. Worthies are just not able to lose it. His claim, right then, I think it's actually a plausible claim. His claim is that everybody, let's say everybody, that's what he says is everybody, has something that they would die for, or some limit that they would not cross to preserve their own life, right? He gives various different examples of that. I'll talk about some of the examples. But you can read this basically as a critique of a narrow sense of self-interest, right? Because what Mengzi is really saying is, yes, you should do what you really want. That's what you should do, is what you really want. But if you think about it, you'll see that what you really want is not just your own sensory pleasure and not just preserving your own life, but is for other people to have decent lives as well, right? This question of our true motivation comes up in a number of different passages. The most famous is this one about the child falling into the well, where he says, this is the reason I say all people have a heart of not bearing harm to other people. Now, if people suddenly see a small child about to fall into a well, all will have a heart of alarm and compassion, not to get in good with the child's father and mother, not to seek a reputation among the neighbors and friends, and not because of hating the sound of it or hating the reputation of having of it. Right, so is this, again, just a kind of saying that what we naturally would feel in this circumstance is concern and probably implied a desire to help. He doesn't go so far as to actually say anybody would help in that circumstance, but anybody would feel some concern for it, right? And this is, again, trying to illuminate our actual true motivations. He gives other examples, right? Another famous one is a king who sees an ox being led to a sacrifice, and he says it looks frightened like an innocent person going to execution, and he orders that the ox be set free. Another different kind of feeling, a different kind of affect, is he describes the origins of funerals, saying that in the beginning, people just drug the bodies out of the town and left them there to rot. And then one day they walked out and they saw the corpses of their parents being eaten by wild animals and infested by insects, and they felt this sense of horror. And so they went back and got shovels and buried the bodies, right? Another one that is more along the lines of things that we would die for is a dialogue where somebody says to one of Mengzi's disciples, which is more important, eating or ritual? And the disciple says, ritual. And the guy says, which is more important, sex? And it really means kind of reproduction, or ritual, and he says, ritual. And the guy says, well, okay, imagine a circumstance where if you were to follow all the proper rituals, you won't be able to get any food and you'll starve to death. But if you don't follow all the rituals, you can get some food and eat it. Should you just starve to death then? And then he says, imagine a situation where if you don't go through the formal familial introductions, you're not going to be able to get a wife and have kids. But if you skip those, you could get a wife and have kids. What should you do? His disciple is confused because it seems like obviously in those cases you should eat and you should take the wife, right? So he goes back to Mengzi, and Mengzi says, well, that's not a good comparison, right? You can say that gold is heavier than feathers, but that doesn't mean that a clasp of gold is heavier than a cartload of feathers, right? So you can't compare an insignificant ritual with the most significant things of life. Then he says, go back and ask him, if you're starving and your brother's starving and the only way you can survive is to steal his food from him, would you do it? Or if your only way that you could get a wife is to climb over your neighbor's yard and steal his young daughter, would you do it? And the point there, Mengzi thinks, is that people will say no, they wouldn't. In that circumstance, they would die, right, or not reproduce. So this is another good example of this kind of priority, this sense that our true desires have this kind of goodness, Mengzi would say, right? Now, yeah, those are the other examples. All of these examples have a kind of certain set characteristics, right? So they all are spontaneous reactions. Usually it emphasizes that they were spontaneous reactions. That are always stimulated by some external thing. We see the ox, and Mengzi says if you didn't see the ox, you wouldn't have felt sorry for it, basically. You see the corpses, so you kind of know that they're there. You've been dragging the bodies out of the city, right? But it's when you see it that you're triggered with this kind of affect. The responses are never based on reason or reflection, right? They're affective, emotional responses. And they never appeal to what's objectively right or wrong. And that's interesting. I mean, Mengzi nowhere says that it's somehow objectively wrong to not bury your parents, right? His point there is that it's horrible to think about, right? It makes us feel really bad. And that's why we have funerals. That's why we do it, right? Because it's ultimately expressing our true desires. And I think the reason why he doesn't appeal to objectively what's right and wrong there is that he recognizes that from a kind of perspective of Tien, it doesn't actually matter, right? From the perspective of Tien, things die, they get eaten by other stuff, they get incorporated back into nature. You know, there's no way to say that burying is right or not or any of that kind of thing. I think Mengzi's view is that the grounding for why we do these things, why we have ethics, is because it expresses these most fundamental desires that we have. Now, these examples, some of the examples I gave, particularly the one about choosing life or choosing rightness, or the one about, taking your brother's food or starving to death, right? They have a kind of tragic dimension to them, right? Because Mengzi recognizes that what we all want is to be nice to other people and have material pleasures. That's what we all actually want. It's just if we have to choose between them, if we get into a kind of tragic situation, he thinks that we would sacrifice, or we should sacrifice, the material things. Right? And that is a recognition of the problem of evil, ultimately, on Mengzi's part, because the Mohists would deny that possibility. The Mohists say that heaven rewards good people and punishes bad people. So in theory, the position they lay out, you would never have to choose between material goods and what's right. Because if you do what's right, heaven will ensure that the material stuff works out, right? It's similar, actually, in almost any religion, right? I mean, in Christianity or in Buddhism, in Hinduism, of course, in this life it may work out bad for you, but in the end, you will, in terms of pleasure, in terms of what serves your own life, you will be better off to do the right thing always, right? So this gives Mengzi, I think, a kind of tragic position, really, kind of recognition that, no, like sometimes it doesn't work out, and you still should do the thing that's actually right. And the reason you should is because it's what you really want to do. And so I think Mengzi, in a way, just agrees with both of these positions, right? I mean, he agrees that our ethics doesn't fit with the way nature is, right? And that this leads us into tragic conflicts sometimes. The question, though, is then, how does he keep some sense of following nature there, right? And this is through his idea of Xing. So he ends up having, I think, basically a kind of dual relationship to Tien, to heaven, right? So on the one hand, heaven represents the world, the patterns of the world, and there he seems to think it's morally indifferent. It's these sort of neutral cycles that pass. Doesn't guarantee that good people will succeed or that bad people will punish. He does think that, in general, one causal factor is that goodness tends to be rewarded. So he does think that. If you analyze all the things he says about it, his view seems to be that virtue is a factor in success and sheer power is a factor in success. So if you're the king of a powerful state and you're virtuous, you're pretty much guaranteed to succeed, If you're the king of a small state, you're virtuous, maybe. You know, he has a dialogue with the King Wen of Tung where he basically says, well, in the end, he basically says your two options are basically to die defending your kingdom or to flee with all your people, right? Ironically, that guy is killed by another guy that Mencius talks to, but who refuses his advice, right? So there's sort of the evil king who refuses Mencius' advice, in the end, kills the one king who actually listened to Mencius. So that's one relationship that we have to heaven, is as the kind of external order of nature. The other relationship, though, is internal through our Xing, right? Through these affective, spontaneous responses to our environment, right? And as I said, these two can conflict with each other, right? So there's two ways to look at what Mengzi is trying to do. One is he's trying to still link a humanistic ethics to the forces of nature, right? And at the same time, he's trying to justify or explain why we would act for the good, even when that's not supported by the order of nature. And that ultimately, I think, justifies even setting up an opposition to heaven, right? And my quote there is, it's a reference to a specific passage that I didn't read, but it's the one where he says that things go in 500-year cycles. In that passage, he says it's actually been 200 years overdue, and there's still not peace. And why is that? Well, that's because heaven does not now want peace. That's what he says, right? So the cycle is worse than normal, he says, because heaven doesn't want peace now. But that does not lead him to draw the somewhat obvious conclusion that he should stop striving for peace, right? He still strives for peace. That's an opposition to heaven, right? That's what I'm referring to there. And this is done then through appeals to Xing, which I'm translating as natural dispositions. It's linked to Sheng, to generativity, to vitality, is actually built into the character itself, right? So the right part of the character is the same character for Sheng. The left part is a representation of the heart. At the time, well, it's not clear the origins. There are lots of arguments that these were originally the same term, the same concept. Excavated texts do distinguish them usually from each other, so it's, at this point, they were probably distinct concepts. But in any case, the Xing is clearly connected to the sense of vitality. To get clear on this concept of Xing, I want to use a passage from another place, an excavated text. And I think Mengzi is working out of this same background, but this is a kind of more direct explanation of what Xing is. It's actually an explanation of human motivation in general. It says, in general, although people have set dispositions, natural dispositions, Xing, the heart lacks stable commitment. It awaits things and then moves, awaits being pleased and then acts, awaits practice and then is stable. The vital energies, qi, of pleasure, anger, grief, and sadness are Xing. Their appearing on the outside is because things stimulate them. Xing comes out from Ming. Ming is like what's fated, what's allotted. And Ming comes down from Tian, from heaven. The way begins from genuine feelings, and genuine feelings are generated from Xing. The beginning is close to genuine feeling, the ending is close to rightness. Those who know genuine feelings can externalize it. Those who know rightness can internalize it. Love and hate are Xing. Should be loving and hating are Xing. What is loved and what is hated are things. Affirming is good or not good is Xing. What is affirmed as good or not good are circumstances. So here, the reference to vital energies is crucial, to qi is crucial, I think, because what he has in mind here is that these dispositions are a kind of dynamic configuration of qi, this kind of energy, right? And when we feel an emotion, that's because this qi moves, right? So in other texts, like in the Li Ji, you have the contrast between Jing as still and Dong as movement, right? So they're still, and then they're put into movement by external events. And this is, I think, when Mengzi describes what happens when you see the child at the end, about to fall into the well. That's a case of this energy being moved by things, right? So that happens, you see it, it stimulates the movement of this vital energy, and that appears as a feeling of alarm and concern for the child, right? It's interesting that in this passage, and in the Xing Ming Chu in general, I think there's no kind of teleology involved. And what I mean by that is there's a sense in which in the Xing Ming Chu, some of these feelings that we get are good, some are bad, they all come from heaven, right? There's no imperative just to sort of just express them, develop them, anything like that, right? They're kind of just facts about how we are. And based on that, we need to set up a world that works for us based on these natural feelings. Yeah. Okay. So the connection then between Xing and Tian, partly I think is through vital energy, even for Mengzi. And I'll come back to that point as I go further through it. This link, though, between Xing and the broader forces of nature, partly is just from its derivation from Tian, right? So the fact that Xing comes from Tian is connecting it back to these broader forces of nature. And then again, Qi is associated, I translate it as vital energies because it's closely associated with life, right? So various places say that when Qi gathers, there's life, and when it disperses, there's death, right? So that already is implicating Xing in this kind of broader vitality of the natural world. For Mengzi, he connects them in a number of ways, but this passage is explicit on it. He says, "Those who have exhausted their hearts know their natures. Knowing their nature, they know heaven. To preserve the heart and nourish one's nature is the way to serve heaven. To not think twice about long or short life, but to cultivate oneself to await it. This is that by which one establishes fate." So his point there, I said there's a dual relationship to heaven. I think what he's trying to do there is distinguish them and say the proper one is through the internal forces of Xing, right? So we don't know the context of that. People often take it as emphasizing the connection to heaven. But I think the emphasis is probably much more to say, no, you don't follow heaven by imitating the patterns of nature. That's not how you follow heaven. Just follow the things that are internal to you. That's how you follow heaven. What's striking is the last lines, right? Because as soon as it says you are serving, following heaven, it reminds you that that doesn't mean you're going to succeed. It doesn't mean you're going to get rewarded, anything like that. At the same time that you serve heaven, remember and be ready to face a long life or a short life, because you have no idea what you're going to get, right? So it's interesting that right in that passage it emphasizes this element of the problem of evil, really, right? That just because you do this doesn't mean you're going to get rewarded. Okay, so what is this connection to heaven? It's fairly common to say that there's a kind of teleological command kind of view of heaven here, that heaven wants us to follow our Xing, and that's why following our Xing serves heaven. I think that doesn't make sense given all the things he says about heaven, the neutrality of heaven, the cycles, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's interesting that the only places where he ever attributes an event to heaven is when that event is bad, right? There's not a single case where a good thing happens and he says, oh, that was heaven, right? It's always bad things that happen. So I think it's not about following the commands of heaven or something like that. I think heaven is actually fully naturalized for him here. It's referring to the kind of forces of the world with a kind of divinity to them, right? But still, it's referring to the forces of the natural world. The link to heaven, I think, is instead about connecting to these vital forces, this generativity, this vitality of nature. One way that you see that is how it's described as in continuity with other natural processes or like other natural processes. The two main ones that are used are metaphors of water and of plants, right? So he says of our Xing, of these dispositions, if you start to develop them, it will be like a spring beginning to extend forth, right? It will just naturally flow and flow and flow. Another one talks about what it is to be rooted. It says, the original spring flows immensely, not ceasing day or night, filling all crevices and then moving forward, reaching to the four seas. That which has a root is like this. It was just this that Kongzi was emphasizing, right? The plant metaphors, I think, make the same thing. So that occurs in his description of human nature. If you know Mengzi, the four beginnings of the virtues he describes as the four duan of the virtues. That character, the right part of it, is just the character for a sprout, right? Together, it would more technically mean beginning, or Jushi takes it as meaning like the tip of it. But from other excavated texts, you find the same use without the radical. So it just says sprout in those texts, right? I mean, at the time, probably it wasn't written with a radical. So whether it meant beginning or sprout is not clearly distinguished in the first place. Other times he says, the people will respond to a good ruler like dry grass responds to rain. Another, as a general statement, he says, if it attains its nourishment, there's no thing that will not grow. If it loses its nourishment, there's no thing that will not die out, right? This is, again, referring to as a metaphor for these dispositions that we have, right? So these metaphors are emphasizing the continuity between these natural drives, these natural responses, and the general vitality of nature. Another place this comes up is with the use of qi, right? So qi only appears a couple of times in the Mengzi. One crucial time is describing the growth of trees on a mountain, where he says that the qi nourishes the trees to grow during the night. During the day, people come and cut them down, but then the qi keeps them growing, right? So the qi is associated with growth again there. But the key passage is this one, I think. And it's a long, complicated passage, but Mengzi has just described his immense flood-like qi, right? So he says he has this powerful flood-like qi. His disciple asks him about it. He says, it's difficult to put in words. Regarding this qi, it is the greatest and the firmest. Use uprightness to nourish it and do not harm it, then it will fill the space between heaven and earth. As for this vital energy, it pairs with rightness and the way. Without these, it starves. It is what collecting rightness generates and not what rightness can take in a sneak attack. If one acts but there's something unsatisfying to the heart, then it starves. Thus I say Gaozi never knew rightness because he made it external. Right, so the last line shows this is about why it's important to have the virtues rooted internally in our affective responses to the world, right? On this point about not harming the qi, right? To nourish it and not harm it, he there gives the story of a man, the man of Song, who wants his plants to grow faster, so he goes out in the field and pulls on them all, and they all die, right? And he says, regarding the qi, regarding your nature, you don't want to pull on it, but you also don't want to neglect weeding it, right? So you have to take care of it, but you have to also let it grow out of its own generative power, right? And that applies to this qi as well. What's interesting here, I think, is that he says, if one acts but there's something unsatisfying to the heart, then the qi starves, right? You would think that the heart is what would starve, but it's the qi that starves, right? Now that's confusing and strange, right? But it shows, I think, that he's thinking of this qi as already configured into these particular affects, right? So the heart reacts in certain ways to stimuli. We feel compassion for a child in danger or an animal that's frightened in a certain way. We feel horror when we see corpses, right? This is how qi flows through us. And if you stifle those affective, those emotional responses, you actually kill the qi, right? And you become, sometimes it seems to imply that you become actually unhealthy, right? Insofar as a person who has this virtue seems, he says you can see it in the fullness of their back, right? But if you have this qi, because everything is interconnected with this qi, you get this kind of power, right? That's what he says, that this qi that he has fills the space between heaven and earth, right? I don't think it means that his qi literally fills all that space, but his qi is interconnected with it. It has an effect on that. And so you get these descriptions of a kind of almost magical power, right? He says, the people of a true king are expansive and content. They can be killed without being resentful, and they can be benefited without being grateful. The people move daily toward goodness, but do not know what makes them so. Where gentlemen pass is transformed, and where gentlemen reside is magical. Above and below, flowing the same as heaven and earth, how can one say it is but a small assistance? There are a few links to the Daodejing here, I think. One is, the Daodejing mentions assisting the ziran of things and uses fu, a slightly different character, but actually the excavated text versions of the Daodejing all use different characters for that character, right? So really it was probably just the kind of base without the radical, in which case this might be the very same word. It also seems to echo the idea of the people in the Daodejing who are sort of under the order brought about by the sage, but don't know that the sage did anything, and they just say, well, we're ziran, we're this way spontaneously, right? The word I've translated as magical is hard to translate. It's actually shen, which could mean godlike also, or spiritual has the wrong connotations, I think, but godlike would be another way that you could put it. Okay. So then, to kind of summarize Mengzi's position here, and then I want to move into some problems with it. I think his philosophy is based on the idea that we do need to stay connected to these vital forces that derive from Tian, right? But his view is that every particular thing expresses that vital force in a different way, right? And so we don't identify with it in the kind of impartial total view. We identify with it by expressing it as it is in us, right? And that's similar to these views that appeal to preserving your life and all that. It's just that he thinks the way that we express it is through these particular emotional responses to the world, through these feelings of something like concern, right? And I think I forgot, don't have that slide in there. Underlying, I think, is actually two differences. So one is a difference on their view of human nature, right? So Mengzi thinks it's our nature to care about other people, Other people think it's our nature to preserve our lives. Other people think that it's our nature to seek sensory pleasure. But I wonder if there's something more fundamental that's different, which is how you look at what nature produces. Because the first two views about preserving your life or seeking sensory pleasure see life as fundamentally individuated, right? It's my life in particular. It's my pleasures in particular. It's my hands, not Shui's hands, right? Mengzi is really pointing towards something like networks or communities, right? Because if you think about this as qi that's flowing, right, there's a kind of circulation of this vital energy among human beings that seems to be the real kind of unit, right? So I think there is something about the view of the individuation of life that's differing here, that's in the background. But I'm not sure of that, but I suspect that that's the case. Okay, before turning to problems with it, just to say a little bit in a kind of comparative context, right? So I think we can fairly reasonably say that Mengzi has a virtue ethics in the sense that it's based on a conception of what it is to be flourishing as a human being, right? So insofar as a virtue ethics is based on a conception of flourishing humanity, flourishing human being, I think we can say that. And more than that, he aligns with approaches that try to connect the specifically human good to the nature of being or to nature as a whole, right? And this is what I put here, examples of that, right? So one would be a more theistic view that God creates the world, but in creating the world gives sort of finite rules to different kinds of things. And so human beings derive their duty from the particular role that they were given, right? So there's no sense that our role is to be like God in creating the world. The sense is we're given a particular role by God. And I've said that's from command. It could be from, I don't know, a kind of Thomistic view. It would be more teleological in the Aristotelian sense. So Aristotle would be another example. He thinks ultimately all things that exist imitate the eternal. Everything strives to be eternal, right? They head toward the unmoved mover. For human beings, that means we seek knowledge, which is unchanging. So that's our way of emulating the eternal, is to build up kind of eternal knowledge. But also it's to excel in one's particular function in that whole, right? But it's teleological in that the whole system of nature is motivated toward an end, which is emulation of the eternal, right? The third one here I put, there are various people who try to sort of take up an Aristotelian framework using evolution rather than emulating the eternal. I think it's a ridiculous approach, actually. So I can't even defend it really. But it is, you find various people trying to argue that ethics comes from trying to excel in the functions that human beings have evolved to have. Mengzi, I think, is a kind of analogous approach, but it's based on a kind of vitality that's immanent in being or nature and all the myriad things, and then we express that through human affects. And what's interesting, I think, about Mengzi's approach is that it requires no sense of purposiveness in nature, right? So unlike the other ones, which ultimately, insofar as purposes are anthropomorphic, I would say, right? They require some kind of projection of purposeness into the universe. Mengzi, I think, does not require that. Now, I will say this disagrees with the most common readings of Mengzi, say Brian Van Noorden's reading, who read him as a kind of Aristotelian. I think that that's wrong, and I think it misses actually what's really interesting about Mengzi's position here. But I think that leads partly into the difficulties, right? And I think there's two primary difficulties. Because Mengzi is actually not saying, do whatever you want, just be yourself, right? That would be easy to defend if that was his position. He has a normative position that you should try to emulate the sages. You want to be like Yao and Shun, right? So the problems that he faces is in this move from saying, express your natural feelings to saying, model yourself after the sages. And I think it has a couple complexities to it, right? One is there's a problem that we could say human beings differ from each other. We don't all have exactly the same Xing, and so we can't all follow the same model. Part of that is the difficulty in determining what counts as a flourishing human life, right? So Aristotelians, Mengzi, I think, have a sense that that's something we can determine based on what it is to be human, and we can all emulate that, we can all follow that, right? But that's something that would have to be justified. The second problem that he will have is the flexibility of human beings, so that how we react to things seems like it's not just natural, but depends on culture, perspective, cultivation. And the difficulty is, of course, Mengzi has to admit that point, right? Because that's a premise of our being able to become like a sage, right? If our nature was set, it would be no point in saying we should emulate Yao and Shun. We have to be able to change our nature. It's also the way he explains bad people, right? So why are there bad people in the world if our natural tendencies are to care for other people? Well, it's because their environment destroys these things, right? It stifles these things, right? So he has to admit that there's this flexibility. And this, I think, captures his position really well. It's actually, I really like this passage. He says, "Therefore, gentlemen have anxiety until the end of their lives, but are without one morning of trouble. What they are anxious about is this: Shun was a person, I'm also a person. Or Shun was human, I'm also human. Shun was a model which the world could transmit to later generations, but I still cannot avoid being a mere commoner. This can be an anxiety. What kind of anxiety? To be like Shun, and that is all." I didn't put the whole quote, but he says they have no trouble because they don't care about external material things. So you end up poor, that doesn't bother you because all you care about is virtue. So he's trying to distinguish the things you should worry about, which is becoming like Yao and Shun, from the things you shouldn't be troubled by, which is your material circumstances. That ties back to the first lecture. I talked about fatalism, making a distinction between the internal and the external, right? That's what he's relying on there, is that kind of distinction. So I think in looking at the difficulties here, we could look at Zhuangzi as pushing all of those difficulties. And that's what I want to conclude with, is a little bit of Zhuangzi. So first, Zhuangzi argues that things are singular. They don't exist in types, right? So each thing just is what it is. It's a singular thing. We can generalize to say they're human. We could generalize to say male and female. We could generalize to say animal, right? We can generalize in lots of ways, but in fact, each thing is singular and unique. So they can't be held to the same standard. The other thing that he emphasizes is that we're flexible. Our reactions to things, our affective reactions, are not determined by nature, but rather by our perspective, right? These are the two things that he'll push. So on things heaven making things singular, he says, Gong Wenxuan saw the officer of the right who was missing a foot and said with surprise, "What kind of person is this? Why is he unique?" Or it could be, "Why is he one-footed?" It's a play on words there. It could be, "Why is he one-footed? Why is he unique? Was it given by heaven? Was it given by humans?" The officer of the right said, "It was heaven, not human. Heaven generates any this so as to be singular. The appearance of humans have what is given. By this I know it was heaven, not human." There's actually a number of complexities with that passage, but taking "do" there as singular, I think, is correct. Brooke, you read it that way too, right? And so emphasizing the singular uniqueness of each thing. The foot reference is significant because Mengzi says that we all have these affective responses in the same way that we all have four limbs, right? Another passage about the sameness of human nature says that, asks about a famous shoemaker and he said that if he had to make a pair of shoes for someone he hadn't met, he would know to make shoes and not baskets. The point there is, and this is because human feet all have something similar to them, right? So this is probably not coincidence, all of the one-footed characters in the Zhuangzi. It's to say, can we really say that these are defective compared to the other people, right? That's essentially Mengzi's argument, is that, well, it is that's his argument, is that it's defective, right? This leads into a problem of what can count as flourishing, right? Because if we all have different natures, then what it is to flourish will be different for different people, and you can't all want to be like Yao and Shun. So this is a famous example of this. In this story, a carpenter sees this giant tree, and his disciples are all in kind of awe of it, and the carpenter says, don't pay any attention to it, it's utterly worthless, you can't make anything out of it. And then when he falls asleep, the tree appears to him in a dream and gives this sort of speech to him. What will you compare me to? Will you compare me to those refined trees, the hawthorn, pear, tangerine, or pomelo, those that have fruits or melons? When the fruit is ripe, they're pulled off. When they're pulled off, the tree is abused. Large branches are broken and small branches are bent down. Thus, by their abilities, they make their own lives bitter. They do not finish their heavenly years and die in the midst of the way, themselves bringing on the assaults of the worldly and vulgar. Things all are like this. Right. So the point there is that we would look at that tree and think it's defective, it's odd, but in fact it's flourishing, right? On its account, it's flourishing. And I think the point that Zhuangzi makes over and over again is that if you look at what we take as flourishing, it usually is what is actually most useful to us, right? So there's a kind of utilitarian bias built into the conception of flourishing. This is Zhuangzi's argument, at least. I don't want to talk too much longer, so I'll kind of maybe skip through. No, I can only have a little bit left, I guess. I A number of passages then play on this to talk about the dangers of holding people to a single standard. This is you can read through the story. The context of the story, though, is that Yan Hui is going to persuade a king to become good, and Kongzi looks worried about it. Kongzi there is not really representing Confucius, right? But he looks worried. Somebody asks him why, and he says, he's going to go to this king, and he's going to talk all about Yao and Shun, and the king is going to look at himself and think, I can never be like them, and he's going to kill him, basically. And then he goes into this story, right, and then ends this by saying, this is why the sages did not try to make everybody do the same thing. Another great example of this, I think, is he says that there was a guy who was famous for his ability to fast during mourning. Everybody in the village tried to imitate him, and they died, right? There are a number of different stories like that, right, about how you can't all try to imitate them. And the interesting thing is that they very frequently use this word anxious. That's the word Mengzi uses for always being anxious and about not being shun, right? So it's possible it's a play on Mengzi's own language about always having this anxiety about not living up to the standards set by Yao and Shun. A more radical position out of Zhuangzi is emphasis on the flexibility of human affects. And this is, I think, the most important passage on this, right? Describing sagely people. He says, since they receive food from heaven, what use are humans? They have human form, but do not have human qing. Qing is these natural affects that we have. Sorry, I should have translated it for the slide. They don't have fixed or natural affects, you could say, emotions. Having human form, they flock with humans. Not having natural human emotions, right and wrong, or so and not so, do not reach to their persons. They are fine in their smallness, they are grouped with humans, they are great in their bigness, so they are singular in completing the heavenly. Huizi then says to Zhuangzi, since you call them human, how can they not have these sort of defining affects? Zhuangzi says right and wrong, or affirming and not affirming, are what I'm referring to as qing. What I call having no qing, none of these affects, refers to people's not letting loves and hates inside to harm their persons. They constantly rely on spontaneous self-sowing, not adding to life. One thing you can think about here, right, is that any kind of affective reaction depends on some kind of cognitive frame, right? So the child at the well, although it's spontaneous, you have to recognize that it's a child and that it's in danger, right? To have that kind of feeling. Otherwise, if you think the child can fly, you might just look on with curiosity waiting to see it fly, right? So there's a kind of cognitive frame for it. To get angry depends on interpreting a situation in a way that you see as offensive in some way, right? What Zhuangzi here is saying by talking about shi and fei, affirming and not affirming, is that because we can change those labels, the affects themselves become utterly flexible, right? This connects back to the skepticism and stuff I talked about last time. If we see death as bad, then of course we're going to be afraid when death appears, and we're going to feel bad when people die. If we don't see death as bad, then we won't feel that way, right? It's not an issue of repression. It's because it's just a sort of seeing something not as bad, right? It's seeing it as good instead of as bad. So it sets up then this kind of flexibility in our emotions. The consequences of this, say in relation to Mengzi, of Zhuangzi's arguments, the first one is just that there's no single standard for a flourishing human being. That would still leave the possibility that you should express your own nature in the best way you can, right? The more radical conclusion of it, though, is that human beings can change their reactions to the world. This vital force doesn't have to go into such narrow channels. And it seems like as you might even be that a rigid perspective actually stifles that vital energy, right? So whereas Mengzi says if the heart's dissatisfied, the qi will starve, I think Zhuangzi's view would almost be if the qi is locked into certain kinds of judgments, then it will starve or dwindle or wither or something like that, right? And this appears, and this is the last passage I want to look at, in the famous passage of the fasting of the heart. Here Confucius is giving advice to Yan Hui, his student. And Yan Hui is trying to figure out a kind of plan to go and persuade this ruler to become good. It's a different passage. Kongzi tells me he should fast. He says, well, I've been fasting. And Kongzi says, no, that's not what I mean. I'm talking about the fasting of the heart. Hui said, may I ask about the fasting of the heart? Zhongni's, Confucius said, make your resolve one. Do not listen with your ears, but listen with your heart. Do not listen with your heart, but listen with vital energy. Hearing stops at the ears, the heart stops at symbols. Vital energy is empty and awaits things. Only the way collects emptiness. Emptiness is the fasting of the heart. This idea that the heart stops at symbols, right? The word for symbols there was a kind of tally that would be broken into two parts. And one person would get one part and the other person would keep the other part. And then you would recognize the sort of authenticity of something by if the parts fit together or not, right? So it's something that can only sort of fit with actually one other thing, right? So it has a kind of set shape that keeps it from being flexible. That's what the heart stops as here. So if you empty the heart, then this qi, this vital energy, can freely react to whatever is happening, right? One way to think about what's going on here in this conflict with Mengzi is that Mengzi is uniting the flow of the qi with the kind of direction of the affects, right? So that it's kind of one thing. It's just the feeling of compassion is both a kind of implicit judgment and an affective response, and those for Mengzi are not separable from each other, right? It's kind of one kind of unified response. What Zhuangzi is doing is basically distinguishing those two elements to say that you could have that flow of qi, right? But if you shift the cognitive frame, the labels, then it could go any different direction that you wanted. So in a way, in Zhuangzi's position, you end up with two, I think, kind of mirrors of the same thing. On the one hand, you have this total inclusivity that I talked about last time, where life and death are equal. There's no objective position to distinguish things from. On the other hand, you have this kind of utter flexibility of qi that can just mold itself to whatever situation there is, right? Now, as for weighing these against each other, I'm not sure what to say. I will say, though, that Mengzi's position, part of why he's susceptible to this objection is precisely because he doesn't have this kind of teleological view, right? So he's talking about how to express this generative force. If Zhuangzi is right, that it can be expressed in any kind of way, then it's a little difficult to see how Mengzi can respond to that position, right? Because he doesn't have a way to say, well, yeah, but you're going against heaven in the big picture, right? I don't think he can say that, because I think he agrees that heaven is impartial in the big picture, right? This is what I think makes it difficult for him to respond to here. And, okay, I'll stop with that then.
Sorry, you can speak. Oh, yeah, okay. So in both Mengzi and Mengzi, sage people are minorities, right? Within Mengzi, there are people who don't act like pretty people, even when they are used to pretty conditions and their hearts on the roof and they're in minority. And in Zhuangzi too, and those skillful people survive really. And about they are called German, they are very humans, but they're in minority. There's evidence that we all share the same nature in the sense that we all have ability to be sage people, and what those sage people are doing, those gatherings, nourishing what is in your heart. So there is some acknowledgement that what is being cultivated, be it emptying the heart or cultivating what is in the heart, is a human thing to do. I would say consistent, but on the other hand, they are in minority. And instead of it to explain that gap, acknowledging just a human feature about the fact that only minority people do that. And related to the question, so there's this nostalgia of old times, right? Would you say that even at old times in the Mengzi, right, is it the conditions that make sage people in minority or in those nostalgic times where they are more individual?
Yeah. Those are the hard questions. There is, I mean, it ends up being a fairly similar structure between Mengzi and Zhuangzi in the sense that they're all using exemplary figures, right? And you could say, well, the difference is that the Zhuangzi and exemplary figures are all very different from each other. They're doing completely different things. Their concrete actions are really different. And that's true, right? But there is still a commonality to them, which is precisely this flexibility and this kind of adaptability that they all share. So there is a way in which it is still setting up a kind of, implicitly at least, a kind of be like Yao and Shun kind of model, right? Only the characters are the butcher and, and various different kinds of characters. And even Mengzi, right, emphasizes that sages, the actions they do can be very different, right? I mean, this is something that they share. I think Mengzi doesn't see it as varying as much as Zhuangzi does, but he says lots of things that, in certain times people will take office, and other times other people didn't take office, but their Tao was the same, right? They were just responding to circumstances. That's a sign of a sage for all the Confucians as well, is that you're not locked into a kind of predetermined action, but you can adapt to the circumstances. But there's still, I think, in terms of the level of, the variations of models of exemplary figures, there's a much wider variety in Zhuangzi than there is in Mengzi. I think, though, I was going to say that the difference is that Mengzi would want to say that you're somehow wrong if you don't become like Yao and Shun, whereas Zhuangzi would just kind of say, well, you'd be much happier if you were like that. And I think that Zhuangzi is not making the same kind of normative argument. But that's not actually quite right either, because Mengzi, I think rhetorically might say that you're wrong, you're bad if you don't try to be like Yao and Shun, but really his argument is you're not going to be as happy. In some, not happy, but you're not going to be as fulfilled or something, right? Because you're not going to develop these reactions that would make your life better in terms of actually getting what you want. So one way to look at the choice between them, I should say, like, on a personal level, I've probably since I got into philosophy, the main struggle for me has been between Mengzi and Zhuangzi, and then that still continues, and I kind of drift back from one to the other in different ways. But one way to put the choice between them is, which one of these is more appealing, right? And I think actually neither of them have a good response to that. If somebody says, yeah, but I want to try to fix the world. I want to try to become like Yao and Shun. What could Zhuangzi say? I mean, Zhuangzi can say, well, I think that's going to bring you a lot of suffering. You're probably going to get frustrated. They can say you might die, but the Zhuangzians themselves will admit that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's only depending on your perspective. So they can't really say much. And if somebody says, well, I don't want to become like Yao and Shun. I want to, fish, as Zhuangzi says. What can Mengzi really say? I mean, all Mengzi can really say is that, you're going to be less happy if you do that. And this is where I guess it's a disagreement about human nature, but this may be getting too personal even, but I feel like it's like they appeal to different things in a person, I feel like. There's something admirable about trying to save the world. There's something appealing about that, even recognizing that you might fail, and that you might end up being pretty unhappy. And there's something obviously appealing about wandering free and easy, as Zhuangzi recognizes. And in a way, they might both be appealing to that intuition. I will say, this is maybe a kind of radical reading of Mengzi to put it into those terms. Mengzi certainly uses moralizing language, you know what I mean? And he would say that you're a xiaowin, a petty person, and that kind of stuff that Zhuangzi wouldn't do, I think. But on the appeals to the past, I don't think that I think they're working on two levels. One is I think they're actually a kind of critique of, an undermining of Confucian appeals to the past by projecting a further past that's not like the Confucians say. So I think it's kind of a rhetorical move to describe a past that's not like the Confucians are saying. On the other hand, I think it's trying to describe what it would be like without civilization. So it's kind of thought experiment of like if all this stuff wasn't developed, what would it be like? I kind of think that on whether everybody would be kind of sagely in that circumstance, some of there's probably disagreements in the text on that actually. People might be like animals which do struggle to survive and do get locked into perspectives. Other questions?
I have a question. Actually, according to your reading of Mengzi, it seems that you seem to emphasize more the fluid and singular aspect of Mengzi's thinking, like the human cultivation is related to kind of maximizing cosmic force in a very singular and fluid situation. And my question is related with how your way of reading can fit with some sort of old Confucian theme of orderliness. Orderliness is like in some sense, what I'm trying to say is that, yeah, even though there's some dynamic aspect of Qi that generates every reality, but so if there should be any concrete reality, that kind of movement of cosmic dynamism comes to be concretized in a certain specific orderly distribution. So like in that respect, so in some sense like even though a certain person has the same Qi, but his distribution of Qi should be differentiated according to situation that one is committed to. Like what I'm trying to say is that if he is a son to his father, the movement of Qi should be different. Then he is, as a leader in a society or something like there should be some sort of distribution of Qi, which should be distributed orderly according to each situation. So I just wonder whether you think monks does not emphasize that kind of orderliness that much, or whether that orderliness can be interpreted in terms of the dynamic aspect that you described.
I think that I was afraid I was going to drop my water on the computer. Didn't die, so that's really good.
Is it on the computer?
Is there any way to just set that down, the computer?
Can you take off the...
All right, sorry. It was just like a little space this big where the cup was sitting. Okay, sorry, so I got distracted from this.
Keep going.
Right, with order, the big contrast might be with two different views about order, right? So later Confucians, say the Neo-Confucians, are going to see basically two distinct elements of making up the world. One is kind of gender vitality, and the other is the kind of patterns that form. Right? I don't think that's the early Confucian view. Right? So there's a sense there in which there's two, the Li has a kind of, the patterns themselves, the order itself has a kind of, right? I don't think you have that in the order period, right? I think there, Moses' view would be that the order is an outcome of the dynamism, right? So the dynamism works in such a way that it takes on cyclical patterns, particularly, differentiates itself in different ways. But that order is a kind of product of that vitality, rather than something that's equal to it or precedes as we get into the Confucian stuff. The other thing that I want to distinguish my position from is an idea that, I mean, so they all think that there are patterns of movement, right? And that we can think of how long the 500-year cycle is a pattern, right? So he thinks that there are these recurring patterns. I think, though, I would distinguish Moses' view from a view that would say we model human institutions in imitation of certain patterns, right? I think he's actually opposing that, right? And I read Moses as not as far from the internal-external debate as some people do, right? So very quickly, I think the view say in the Xing community is we have these affects. Some of them are good, some are bad, some should be increased, some should be diminished. Sages over time develop institutions that manage those problems. So the negative ones get restrained, the positive ones get exploited and used. Right? Out of this they made the rituals, they built a culture. Right? And that's what we follow. I think that Moses would agree with that like the rules that we follow, the rituals, all that is a creation of the sages, and it's not copy of nature, it's not modeled on natural order or hierarchy or those kinds of things. It is a human creation. Where I think he disagrees is that he thinks all of these tendencies that we have, all of the things that are virtuous are expressions of these tendencies. Right? So the ones who disagree with think that some of them, like the sense of doing the right thing, is not connected to our natural affects or consideration. Compassion for someone suffering is a natural affect there, but not wanting to violate rules, they think that's a connection to a natural affect. Among the things it does, because we have a natural feeling of something like shame that drives us to follow rules. So I think the idea that, like, the relationship between father and son mimics the relationship between the sun and the earth, or yin and yang, that kind of correlation is a kind of later
But it seems that there are various stories that monks have also some concept of some sort of implicit order that just makes the things go smoothly. Like, for example, in terms of some questions why our country does not have enough population than other countries, that the key issue is kind of to make people feel comfortable in their life. And moreover, in terms of the regicide issues, political theories, in some sense, he seems to say that killing the monarch who just deviates from the true way of a king should be regicide, that should be killed because he just acts as if he's a petty people who is not acceptable to that kind of kingship. So in that respect, there is also some sort of some kind of the properness or orderliness in terms of dealing with various things. So in that respect, I just raise this question. Like, if we can say that dynamism is what matters, then regicide can be also very difficult to explain in terms of that framework, because insofar as that king has a dynamism to do everything that he likes, then there is no reason that we can accuse him as a petty man to be eradicated to be just destroyed, to be removed from his office. So I think it is also related with the issue of kind of the ritual properness of Li issue.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't want to say that. I mean, the fact that this generative force is expressed only in certain emotional configurations. Right. So monks would say a bad king is actually, there's something not satisfying in the heart, right? So it's that she is starved in this case, right? So that would be the reason why you would label him as a petty person, or why he would be, you could say that he's not acting well, right? So certainly the idea that we're monks that this vitality could be expressed in doing anything, right? Monks are strongly opposed to that. So I don't want to say that. And so I hope I'm not sounding like these views that sort of just emphasize spontaneous creativity or something like that. I guess it does sound like what I'm saying. But no, it's crucial that for monks the heart is configured in a very set, determined way, such that that she either starves or grows, depending on whether you stimulate and how to extend emotional responses. With a sense of what's proper, I think what I want to say is that so far as what is proper is grounded in nature. It's a long evolution out of natural human feelings and our ability to think about how to fix the world. Right? So, of course, by Moses' time, he thinks that it's been around for about years, and so they're kind of set. He doesn't try to derive them from our feelings, like that. But I think if he were to give an account of how it arose, it would be that sages looked at our feelings and realized that the best configuration, the best way we can express those, and of course express our desire as well, is to have rulers who are good and have this system, and if somebody's not following that, then they can simply improper. They can simply go right. So I think two crucial things about the origins of me. One is the description of the origins of funerals, right? Which actually two passages come up, and they kind of describe stages of things. So one is that passage I talked about burning them. But another one, Moses says that he describes why he's answering the accusation why he gave his mother such a big funeral, something like that. But he explains that basically over time the coffins got thicker and thicker because that satisfies the heart. And so in his view, they would expect the perfect amount. Maybe it's a commentary. It's not in the monks itself. One of the commentaries explains that basically the coffin should collapse after the body has disintegrated. So like it should last long enough so that the stages of it wearing out correspond to the stages of the body decaying away. But the other one is the statement that in the beginning, right, human beings started emerging from nature, and what it says there is that they had to be taught by creations. Right? It's very explicit that the sages taught by creations. So, of course, monks that things care for family, all that is spontaneous and natural. But if you just follow those spontaneous natural things, you know, other factors are going to get in there, right? If your father's really mean to you, you're going to have this feeling of care for your father, but also feelings of anger, right? If it's just left to the spontaneous feelings, it will get very chaotic and that thing. So the sages, he says, taught people by creations, right? So I think that's a case where, and there's no mention that they base it on correlations with natural phenomena.
So my question is about Leibniz's understanding of the Xing part and this distinction between Xing, natural disposition. One of the slide you quoted was one of the lines that to preserve the heart and the nourishment of nature is the way to preserve people. I think it's kind of difficult to understand this clear distinction between the raw Xing part and natural disposition.
Yeah.
And its relation, like cognitive, if there is any cognitive hierarchy between that, and what's the difference of the role to the human?
Yeah. I think there's a few different aspects of that question, right? So one is that you're sort of right to point out this slippage, I would say, between the heart and our Xing, right? So it's interesting that when he says our Xing is good, the only examples he gives talk about Xing, the heart being good, right? So it's clear that for him, the heart is to some degree incorporated into Xing, right? So to say that our Xing is good, his illustration is that the heart has these 4 different emotional reactions, right? And that's feeling of concern, feeling of shame, feeling of deference, and a tendency to judge. And those are all properties of the heart. So when he's talking about the disposition being good, he's talking about the disposition of the heart being good. Now, why is that? I think there's 2 reasons for it. The one that I think actually makes the most sense is that it's a rhetorical movement, right? So there's a passage in, I think it's 7:24, where he says, the desire of the mouth for good taste, the desire of the ears for good music, desire of the eyes for beauty. These are all part of our Xing, but they also involve meaning, they involve faith. Generally do not talk about them as being our Xing. Right? Then it says, benevolent people, be benevolent, be humane, or be righteous, having your propriety, being sagely. These involve faith in me. These are me, but they involve Xing. Generally don't talk about that in terms of me, faith. Right? That's a pretty clear statement that if we're going to just objectively speak, we would have to talk about the Xing, our Xing being a composite of the reaction of the heart, the reaction of the eye, the ears, all these things. So it would be both these kind of social aspects, you might say moral dispositions, and our desires for good taste and good sight and those kind of things. But rhetorically, we don't talk about them equally. We emphasize the part against the heart. Right? And so why would we do that? One thing I think is the most coherent way to take it, and he doesn't say this explicitly, is that if you cultivate these feelings of the heart, you can satisfy the other desires around it, right? Particularly if you cultivate a simple taste in food, those kinds of things. So you can cultivate simple pleasures, a lot of, the pleasures involving, say, friendship, ritual, things that are actually good, and have this kind of moral commitment, and then everything gets harmonized, everything gets fulfilled, and used. If instead you develop just the sensory pleasures, it'll always be in conflict with the heart, and it'll have this kind of word. I think that's why we use clarity with the heart. Because there's a picture of somebody who established what's great, which is the heart, the other people take their place. There is a cognitive element though where in that same passage he says that the heart is able to think or to reflect or attend or pay attention. Where the other senses are simply led along by things. that there's a tension in the system, though, between these affective responses and this ability to think that I don't think is really worked out, how that goes together. So the heart seems to be special. On the one hand, it's just like, I smell a good smell, or I smell food that I like and I want to eat it. I see a child in danger, I want to help it. Those seem to be exactly the same kind of ontology, right? But the heart is a more important one in that. That's very coherent, but on top of that, he talks about the heart having some ability to not just respond, to reflect. Right? I do think that there's tension in it.
Any questions?
So I have a question about the problem of moving from interpretive to the correlation education. So correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand it, the descriptive refers to just the bare generative process of the chi, whereas the normative refers to sort of the thought force of the generative process. Is that right? And
Yeah.
So my question is, so I've been thinking about what Mencius would say in response to this problem if you were to give an answer to it. And I think one of the things you could say is like, actually the descriptive or the bare generative process is not just a given fact, but presupposes something already known. So for example, let's suppose if sort of the flow of cars is the chi of the traffic system, and the traffic rules are the normative rules of the traffic system. So are the rules inherent in the flow itself, or are they added upon the flow? I think Mencius would probably say that without the traffic rules, well, cars just simply can't move the road because they'll just crash into each other. And it's impossible to guarantee the freedom of the flow, and there's no way to guarantee the vitality of the vital force. So I'm interested in like what if Mencius says something like that, what Zhuangzi would say in response to that question, to that explanation.
I think the I'm trying to think how to map that on because that they get wrong, but part of the problem would be to say that you could generalize then about what the proper order for traffic would be across a completely different intersection or different country or something like that. Right? That's part of the dispute. So if it is the case that everybody she works in the same way, right, then there's not a problem. So I didn't say that it's definitively disproved. Wrong's point is, his argument is that no, people have different natures. We don't all have the same nature, right? And so there's no way to say that everyone should be like Yao Shun. That should be the norm, right? So that's, I think, it's debatable, right? How much they all share the same nature, right? The other more radical point is about, I guess, the status of that order. And Mung's is saying that order is inherent in our nature, in our activity, in our emotions, right? And Mung's is just saying that it's not, right? That it can be, that those emotions can take on all different kinds. And that I think is, again, that's actually kind of more of an empirical question, right? But the problem for Mung's is that, what would you say to somebody to say, well, Zhuangzi has the experience a few times. Zhuangzi not knowing who his wife dies. Right? What can he say to him? So he can say, well, you're not as fulfilled as you would be if you weren't for 3 years. That's a hard thing to think, right? Well, Zhuangzi will say, I'm happy and I'm singing, right? So why do I care about that? Right? So that's kind of a hard argument to make. You can make a strong human nature argument to say, well, Zhuangzi thinks he's happy, but actually he's just repressing his feeling 10 years down the line, kind of a mental breakdown because he didn't want his wife. But that's again empirical, I think that's wrong, right? I think one could do what Zhuangzi did if they took up the perspective that you could see that as that. So then what we're going to say, the other thing would be to say, yeah, but you're not being fully human. That's a hard argument to make too, because, well, for one thing, that's a normative question, like why is should fully human, and I mean, it seems like everybody's equally fully human, right? There's something odd about saying some people are more human than others, or something like that. But I think that's what we would have to say. We would say we're more like an animal than a human. But I think that's really problematic, that claim. And of course, Zhuangzi would, I'm sure, respond like, I don't care. Right? Well, so what? Like, I'm happier this way, so why would I care about humans in the first place? So again, I don't think these are decisive objections against one. What I was trying to say is these are where I think the problems are, where Zhuangzi, I think, is playing one of those problems.
I wonder if the scenario you just sketched might point us in the direction of the substantive contrast ultimately being governmental. In that the consequences for like how we ought to regard drones will be very rich and wonderful. We ought to regard them as a shock. They're excluded in various ways, not given power and so on. And yet, when people inspired by drones writers write their own political tracts, people contributing to the literature and concept, they do actually systematically argue that Zhuangzi, no longer mourning for his wife, actually serves as a model of power and virtue that highly placed people would be justified in. Those arguments may seem rather bizarre to us, and they don't appear with perfect consistency, but it's clear that the application was made with some regularity by certain groups. And it could be that this is a suspicion I've had for a really long time, the Confucians, the preaching Confucians, are basically not talking to people as private citizens much of the time. They're talking to them as people who have hopes for efficient careers and social standing. In which, and the Zhuangzi writings are frequently, though not consistently, aimed at people who don't have much interest in that, who are actually happy to be private citizens. And so, given all the shooting past each other and all the changing of subjects between an archetypal Nancy and an archetypal Zhuangzi, would you agree with like the road of the road when it comes to government and similar practical questions?
I think it does. I think that it's, in a way with Zhuangzi, these affective responses are more fundamental than government. Government is a product of them, not the other way around. And what I mean by that is, from a governance perspective, how do you justify theory? I mean, like, I think the most pretty decisively show that it's foolish policy from a government perspective. It's only important from a government perspective because people actually get sad. And you gotta have some way to manage that. I mean, that Leibniz chapter of Shunzi is quite clear on this. You know, that, I mean, he actually says if you don't have, and I'm saying 3 years, it really is more than 2 years, right? Mourning will go on longer. But he thinks that's the only way to end it, is to have a ritual process gradually down, like culminating in the 2-year process. So there are certain things that you could justify as working politically, but there are other things that I think politics is actually expressing what they think are basic human emotional needs. You know, which is why you could see if you gave that up from a Zhuangzi perspective or whatever perspective and said you don't have to mourn, it would make total sense to structure a politics that didn't involve that. Right? Like, I think the Moists really show it's a big waste of resources to mourn people and have funerals and all that kind of thing. Yeah, that's not to deny the basic, that they're doing extremely different things in that the Monks is concerned with the government and all that. You know. I mean, and that's apparent in that distinction about how he says we're not going to talk about my desire for good food as shit, we're going to talk about my care for other people as shit. That's political, right? It's political in the sense of a sort of move to persuade people to act in certain ways that comes from that leadership position.
I think we're out of time, so let's thank our speaker for
Yeah, those are really good questions.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.